I'm really pleased now to introduce our first speaker, who is Aurora Linnea. She's a radical eco-feminist writer making her home in the state of Maine. She's a regular contributor to Women's Liberation Radio News blog. And the title of Aurora's talk is The Beguines, Medieval Women-Only Space.
So I'm going to be talking about the Beguines as a women's movement and the women's only communities that they developed in the Middle Ages. As it turns out, Jo and I have a real mutual affection for the Beguines, and so she called me in to talk about this, but I will have her pop in to give any thoughts that she has as I go through. So I've been really fascinated by the Beguines since I found out about them a few years ago, as a really illustrative and inspiring example of the possibilities of women's autonomous communities, as well as a historical look at the threat that they pose to men in power, and the subsequent persecution that they face. As a consequence of threatening male power. So the Beguines, as a basic overview, the Beguines were women who came together to live in these informal religious communities that spread across Europe and became really influential and prominent and very large during the Middle Ages, beginning in around the 11th century. Because of these women's efforts to create a way of life for themselves as females outside of direct male rule, whether that was the rule of church leadership or the rule of a husband. Historians have called the Beguines the first European women's movement. And so the women came together in these communities, which grew over time. And what they were seeking was independence from male authority. They also wanted a more self-directed religious practice that wasn't dictated to them by male church leaders, which was the case for women who were in convents. Women also were looking for a way to have greater economic opportunity and economic independence. So to own property and not have it be absorbed by a husband or by the church. And also women just looking for a more supportive communal lifestyle situation with other women. And so those were the real goals. And these women developed the Beguine approach as a means of securing these greater freedoms while still operating enough within the cultural constraints of the period, which were quite stringent, the Middle Ages, to avoid immediate patriarchal condemnation and persecution. So the Beguines were able to have, to really do a lot of quite subversive and radical things as women in this period, in part through maintaining a guise of being good women in their community. So they did play on that for sure. They were devout and all of this. But in this way, they were able to become, the communities were very large, as I said, and they survived for centuries, which is pretty remarkable. However, they still did ultimately end up suffering really significant backlash from patriarchal power, both civic and the church, and were quite significantly harassed. Many women who were Beguines were executed as heretics, and the campaigns against them were severe. However, they were never successful in fully quashing the movement. So there were still active Beguine colonies as late as the early 20th century. So what really put an end to the Beguine way of life was increasing opportunity for women in the public sphere in the 19th and 20th. centuries. To give some historical context to the rise of the Beguines, which did these communities started to be established in the early 11th century, which was the time of the Crusades. So there was a real depopulation of men. They all went to go kill other men, and as typically happens when men go off to wars, and there are more single women able to do things other than get married. Women become more independent and look for other ways of living. So women were moving into urban centers. This was also a period of rising urbanization in Northern Europe. And so women were moving to the cities, and they were looking for work and started to live together in these cities. And that was kind of a real beginning to the formation of these communities. Another factor at this period that enabled the Beguines to begin to come into being was that it was a period of rising literacy and education for women. And as we know, when women have opportunities to be educated, they begin to imagine lives for themselves outside of patriarchally prescribed roles. And that was as true in the medieval period as it is now. And so that kind of lays the groundwork for the emergence of the Beguines. And so these communities started forming with religious women, or ostensibly religious women, coming to live together in smaller homes in the early 11th century, particularly in what's called the Low Countries, so Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, with Belgium being really the hub of the Beguine movement through its history. But so this was where it started, and then over the next couple of centuries, it really spread so that there were Beguine communities of different scales in almost every town or city in Northern Europe, and also with quite large populations of Beguines in France and Germany and in the Scandinavian countries, as well as kind of sister movements that were doing very similar things under a different name in Spain and Italy as well. And Beguines were women from all social classes. The connecting tie was femaleness. So there were women who were aristocrats, women from the merchant class, widows and daughters of knights, as well as women coming from the urban and the rural poor, all came together to live in these Beguine communities. Girls could enter as young as 14, and then women would live there their entire lives. So very mixed. Also interesting to note that there was a male corollary to the Beguine movement, and these were called the Begards, but it never really took off in the same way. It didn't have the same numbers, didn't have the same cultural sway, presumably just in large part because men had more opportunities in general to live outside of their homes than did women. And also male monastics, so in monasteries, weren't cloistered like nuns were, which brings me to the kind of really salient differences. It's really important to understand that Beguines were not nuns. This was an informal religious order. They were not endorsed by the church and were indeed often condemned by the church. I'll talk about a little bit later. And so they weren't nuns. They were not beholden to any church dictated monastic rule. They didn't take vows of poverty, and they could retain their property. They were not cloistered, so they had real freedom of movement, unlike nuns who sort of, once you join a convent in the Middle Ages, certainly women were like stuck there. As Beguines, women performed active ministry and studied theology in quite a serious way, which even nuns were not encouraged to do. And they didn't take binding vows. So they maintained self-determination enough so that they could leave the beguinage if they chose to pursue, well, to get married often, is what women would leave for. But they could do so without risking excommunication or losing all of their reputation. They had freedom to come and go. And really, the most exciting thing to talk about with the Beguines is the beguinages, is these women's communities that they developed, which were women-only spaces, quite seriously. Indeed, many of them, the larger ones, had walls built around them, and some allowed male visitors, some didn't, but there were certainly no like unsupervised men in these communities. It's quite strict. There were different sort of community organizational styles with Beguines. So you could, as a Beguine, just stay in your family home and declare yourself a Beguine and do it on your own. There were also some solo Beguines who lived a more mendicant lifestyle, so they were beggars. There were also smaller communal houses, or maybe 2 or 3 houses with women who lived collectively as Beguines. And then there were these larger, more formally organized communities that were called the Beguinages. The largest of which were, you can read about them as being called cities within cities, or my favorite is miniature towns populated solely by women. They were really quite expansive, and they were called court beguinages, or cities of Beguines. And up to several thousand women would live in these. So in the larger beguinages like Ghent and Neville, which are Belgian cities, there would be as many as 3,000 women living together in these spaces. They were independent parishes. They functioned as villages unto themselves under women's direction. And again, there were these in most of the cities and towns in Northern Europe at this time. So imagine if like any city you went to had a women's land. It's quite extraordinary. I read a really lovely description of the court beguinage as a formidable institution, which would typically comprise a church. They had their own cemeteries. The women ran infirmaries or hospitals, and were quite renowned for this, and as medical practitioners. There were gardens and agricultural fields, bakeries, workshops for craftswomen, and then there could be as many as 100 houses for single women houses, as well as these larger dormitory style houses, which were called convents, in which younger women and women of lesser means lived together. So for example, the Beguinage at Ghent had 18 of these large dormitory houses and 100 or over 100 single women homes. So these were really substantial. And a lot of the complexes are still intact, though Beguines don't live there anymore, but open to visitors. And indeed, I think Jo has visited them. Did you want to say anything about your experiences visiting these places?
You can see from the architecture that they are, well, you could imagine that I could see that they're built by women. They're much more modest, less grandiose. They're sort of small buildings together in a community and incredibly beautiful. So this is one in Kortrijk, which is part of in Brussels, and then there's a Beguines quarter in Amsterdam, but loads of the Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, those sort of areas, Germany, Flanders, they had them. And now this, I'm just going to whiz through these because I think they illustrate what you've been saying a bit. So they were outside of male control, not submitting to monastic order. They were self-defined in opposition to many attempts to control them and define them. They lived in communities. they were also in Bruges, Brussels, walled in rows of houses where hundreds of them lived together. And there's this book, which I haven't read, by Laura Swan, which might be interesting to read, The Wisdom of the Beguines, the forgotten story of a medieval women's movement. And then that fantastic image of this. I mean, it's such a great picture. And I'm just going to show some more images of these. And the middle image shows the women praying, and then they're under the wing of a man, or, you know, a man's wing. But what seemed to happen, and then I'll just show these other prints of a 1489 Begin, and then one in Ghent, this sort of quite stern and powerful looking Begin from Ghent as well. A thing that I really loved about when I lived in Belgium for a long time, in Brussels, so there's quite a lot of knowledge about the Begins, was that they were sort of under male control, but they changed it. They made it their own space, and they they started to have their own direct relationship with God, and then they started to create God in their own image. And there's a fantastic exhibition I went to in 1996 in Brussels. It was of Beguine art by women, and one of the paintings had Jesus with breasts. And I thought, wow, they have decided that God is female. And isn't that massively subversive? And then, of course, there's this sort of contradiction now, because Jesus, or men having breasts, it means a whole totally different thing. But at the time, I sort of thought, wow, these women were just getting on with making a world of their own, a women's land. They were and then they, as you said, they all got shut down, and there was a massive backlash against them. And then, you know, the witch hunts came in, as the Beguinages declined. Women were absolutely not allowed to be outside male control, and there was this huge backlash. So
yeah, so highly recommended is The Wisdom of the Beguines.
oh.
It's a wonderful book. You're interested in this at all, it's like a nice quick little book. It's great. So one of the other things about these about Beguine community life is that they were very self-sufficient, and they developed that intentionally as a way of protecting their autonomy. So in Beguinages, women worked. They received some sort of endowments, but mostly they were sustained by the women's own work. And so Beguines worked, they're very prominent in the textile industry as weavers, spinners. They made dresses, they did lace work, embroidery, and they had a great deal of economic success there. So much so, in fact, that they came into conflict with male run professional guilds, and that was part of their downfall, is that they were really attacked by these male professional guilds who were unhappy with them competing for business in the textiles industry. Also, the women ran these infirmaries or hospitals, as I said, and part of that was their service work. So they helped the poor, and poor women in particular at these hospitals, but they also did have fees for that, for caring for the wealthier people in these in the cities that they were close to. Some Beguines were merchants, which was really quite rare at the time for women to be merchants. Beguines did illumination work on manuscripts. They ran schools on site for local children, and were really respected and revered as educators. And then they also did like housekeeping and laundry services, and ran bakeries and all of these things that allowed the Beguinages to be self-sufficient and economically independent from the church. Another aspect of the Beguinage community that I think is really wonderful is that these were really, really women-centered. So all property was passed down to female relatives who agreed to join the Beguinage, or it was sold to other women within the Beguinage. So they maintained the collective pool of property, and it went down matrilineal lines. Their service work was also really geared towards women, caring for poor women and widows and older women in the infirmaries. I've also read of Beguines providing sanctuary and assistance to women who are trying to get out of prostitution at that point. And they also rented rooms out in the Beguinages to women who didn't want to join the order, but wanted to live outside of the severities of direct male dominion. So they rented rooms out to widows and other women without requiring them to join. Also, unlike in a cloister, they were able to maintain relationships with female friends and family. And so the Beguinages were also always full of female relatives visiting and staying for longer periods of time. And also nice is that the houses, the convents, dormitory houses, were often named after female saints. And so the kind of points of reverence and reference for Beguine spirituality were women. And indeed, as Jo was saying, they did develop within these women's communities, they developed as much of a woman-centered theology as you can get with Christianity, linking femaleness to sanctity and re-envisioning God in more female terms as a mother, which it's I think really lovely to see how having the material space of the women's community allows for this kind of re-envisioning of culture to occur. As far as escaping male authority, there were a lot of ways that that Beguines did that really cleverly. They were very business savvy and used civil legal machinations to prevent interference from church leadership. They never accepted church tax exemptions, so they paid civil taxes to remain outside of church rule. And so on a material level, they were really smart about maintaining their autonomy as communities. And also, women in Beguinages were safe from rape to a great extent. And rape at that time, it was a popular thing for men to do, to try and rape wealthier women and then force them into marriage to save their reputations. And so women in Beguinages didn't have to worry about that. On a spiritual level, the women disavowed the need for male intermediaries in their religious practice, and they took it upon themselves to translate theological works and to have theological discussion. There are a lot of really impressive writings that come out of the Beguine spiritual tradition. I won't go into so much, but a lot of mystical, a lot of the sort of great medieval mystics were involved in the movement. Socially, the women fell outside of or put themselves outside of the patriarchally assigned roles and lived without male supervision. So they were neither nuns nor wives or mothers, and they did away with having men overseeing the way that they lived their lives. And that was not well received ultimately. And so there really was a very severe backlash that lasted centuries against the Beguines. And it came from three directions. The first was from women's families. So there was harassment from families upset by daughters choosing the Beguine life, which they viewed as an attempt to escape from, quote, lawful male authority and the duties of married life, which indeed that is presumably what the young women were doing. So perceptive, but this led to harassment. There was also, as I said, persecution by competing professional guilds. The Beguines' success in textiles put them in competition with men, and the men lobbied for laws that were passed that set limits on Beguines' income, their cloth output, even their use of spindles. And then the men in these professional guilds would also threaten women with, or in fact, accuse women of heresy, which to eliminate the competition, to hold them in thrall a bit. And then obviously the major source of backlash was the church itself, with these accusations of heresy, which could get and did get women in the Beguine movement executed. So there's a really lovely quote from a fellow called Bishop Bruno of Oma, who complained to the Pope in 1273 that Beguines, quote, used their liberty as a veil of wickedness in order to escape the yoke of obedience to their priests and the coercion of marital bonds, which I'm all for liberty as a veil of wickedness to escape the yoke of obedience. I think we should continue with that as much as possible. But Bishop Bruno was not a fan, and he recommended that all of the Beguines be married or thrust into approved orders and put back under the thumb of male authority. The Beguines were accused of heresy. They were also accused of various kinds of sexual immorality, as women are whenever they do things in public. So they're accused of being promiscuous. The Beguine houses were charged with being brothels. Women were charged with the seduction of monks. And that helped to lose popular support for the women. And the real kind of what called open season on the Beguine movement was in 1312. Pope Clement V put out an official edict condemning the Beguines and calling for them to abandon their way of life and likening them to various movements that had been declared heretical. He said that since these women promise no obedience to anyone and do not renounce their property or profess to an approved rule, they are certainly not religious. And he said that the Beguine way of life was to be permanently forbidden and altogether excluded from the Church of God. And so this direction from the Pope gave church authorities leeway to really crack down on the Beguine communities in this time. In the 14th century, the Beguinages were dissolved. A lot of their property was confiscated by the church. Women were forced into convents or back to their families. And there were also, the Beguines had a lot of popular support. They provided healthcare and education. So they were really well liked in the cities and towns where they set up, but the church stipulated punishments for people who helped the Beguines, and that was very damaging as well. And so as the centuries passed, beginning in the 14th century through to the 17th century or so, the Beguines were increasingly marginalized, and the communities grew smaller and smaller and smaller, and were just facing continuous attack. And eventually, kind of where they had once been held in real popular esteem, they came to carry they came to be categorized sort of as undesirables. And also worth noting is that in Germany in particular, the confiscation of Beguine property provided the economic base for the inquisitions of the 14th and 15th or 15th and 16th centuries, which would lead to the execution of thousands of women as witches. And it's been speculated that a lot of the women many of the women who were executed as witches had been involved in Beguine communities. And so I, I really am amazed by the Beguines and what they were able to accomplish, and saddened but not surprised by what happened to them. I think it's really instructive to see just how consistent that dynamic is. And I think from a radical feminist perspective, I know that our goal is transformation of society at large. It's not necessarily the creation of like utopian enclaves, but I do think that you can see with the Beguines quite clearly the necessity and the power of these kinds of enclaves to give space for women to establish self-sufficiency and to have the sort of psychic space outside of male dominion to begin to envision a new culture for themselves and for women that could be scaled out to the culture at large.